The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 7, Side 1. For the men of letters, the poets, the critics, the philosophers, above all the Confucian scholars, were his sworn foes. They fretted under his dictatorial authority, and saw in the establishment of one supreme government an end to that variety and liberty of thought and life which had made literature flourish amid the wars and divisions of the Zhou dynasty. When they protested to Shi Huangti against his ignoring of ancient ceremonies, he sent them curtly about their business. A commission of mandarins, or official scholars, brought to him their unanimous suggestion that he should restore the feudal system by giving fiefs to his relatives, and they added, "For a person in any matter not to model himself on antiquity and yet to achieve duration, that to our knowledge has never happened." The Prime Minister, Li Shu, who was at that time engaged in reforming the Chinese script and establishing it approximately in the form which it retained till our own time, met these criticisms with an historic speech that did no service to Chinese letters. The 5 sovereigns did not repeat each other's actions, the 3 royal dynasties did not imitate each other, for the times had changed. Now your Majesty has for the first time accomplished a great work and has founded a glory which will last for 10,000 generations. The stupid mandarins are incapable of understanding this. In ancient days, China was divided up and troubled. There was no one who could unify her. That is why all the nobles flourished. In their discourses the mandarins all talk of the ancient days in order to blacken the present. They encourage the people to forge calumnies. This being so, if they are not opposed among the upper classes, the position of the sovereign will be depreciated, while among the lower classes associations will flourish. I suggest that the official histories, with the exception of the memoirs of Qin, be all burnt, and that those who attempt to hide the Shi Qing, the Shu Qing, and the discourses of the 100 schools be forced to bring them to the authorities to be burnt. The emperor liked the idea considerably, and issued the order. The books of the historians were everywhere brought to the flames, so that the weight of the past should be removed from the present, and the history of China might begin with Shi Huangti. Scientific books and the works of Mencius seem to have been accepted from the conflagration, and many of the forbidden books were preserved in the imperial library, where they might be consulted by such students as had obtained official permission. Since books were then written on strips of bamboo fastened with swivel pins, and a volume might be of some weight, the scholars who sought to evade the order were put to many difficulties. A number of them were detected. Tradition says that many of them were sent to labor on the Great Wall, and that 460 were put to death. Nevertheless, some of the literati memorized the complete works of Confucius, and passed them on by word of mouth to equal memories. Soon after the emperor's death, these volumes were freely circulated again, though many errors presumably had crept into their texts. The only permanent result was to lend an aroma of sanctity to the proscribed literature, and to make Shi Huangti unpopular with the Chinese historians. For generations the people expressed their judgment of him by befouling his grave. The destruction of powerful families and of freedom in writing and speech left Shi almost friendless in his declining years. Attempts were made to assassinate him. He discovered them in time and slew the assailants with his own hand. He sat on his throne with a sword across his knees, and let no man know in what room of his many palaces he would sleep. Like Alexander, he sought to strengthen his dynasty by spreading the notion that he was a god, but as the comparison limped, he, like Alexander, failed. He decreed that his dynastic successors should number themselves from him as first emperor, down to the 10,000th of their line, but the line ended with his son. In his old age, if we credit the historians who hated him, he became superstitious and went to much expense to find an elixir of immortality. When he died, his body was brought back secretly to his capital, and to conceal its smell it was convoyed by a caravan of decaying fish. Several hundred maidens, we are told, were buried alive to keep him company, and his successor, grateful for his death, lavished art and money upon the tomb. The roof was studded with constellations, and a map of the empire was traced in quicksilver on the floor of bronze. Machines were erected in the vault for the automatic slaughter of intruders, and huge candles were lit in the hope that they would, for an indefinite period, illuminate the doings of the dead emperor and his queens. The workmen who brought the coffin into the tomb were buried alive with their burden, lest they should live to reveal the secret passage to the grave. 2. Experiments in Socialism, Chaos and Poverty, the Han Dynasty, the reforms of Wu Ti, the income tax, the planned economy of Wang Mang, its overthrow, the Tatar invasion. Disorder followed his death, as it has followed the passing of almost every dictator in history. Only an immortal can wisely take all power into his hands. The people revolted against his son, killed him soon after he had killed Li Shu, and put an end to the Qin dynasty within 5 years after its founder's death. Rival princes established rival kingdoms, and disorder ruled again. Then a clever condottiere, Cao Tzu, seized the throne and founded the Han Dynasty, which, with some interruptions and a change of capital, lasted 400 years. The Western Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 24 AD, had its capital at Luoyang, now Honanfu. The Eastern Han Dynasty, 24 to 221 AD, had its capital at Chang'an, now Xianfu. The Chinese still call themselves the Sons of Han. Wen Ti, 179 to 57 BC, restored freedom of speech and writing, revoked the edict by which Shi Huangti had forbidden criticism of the government, pursued a policy of peace, and inaugurated the Chinese custom of defeating a hostile general with gifts. The greatest of the Han emperors was Wu Ti. In a reign of over half a century, 140 to 87 BC, he pushed back the invading barbarians and extended the rule of China over Korea, Manchuria, Annam, Indochina, and Turkestan. Now, for the first time, China acquired those vast dimensions which we have been wont to associate with her name. Wu Ti experimented with socialism by establishing national ownership of natural resources to prevent private individuals from reserving to their sole use the riches of the mountains and the sea in order to gain a fortune, and from putting the lower classes into subjection to themselves. The production of salt and iron and the manufacture and sale of fermented drinks were made state monopolies. To break the power of middlemen and speculators, those who buy on credit and make loans, those who buy to heap up in the towns, those who accumulate all sorts of commodities, as the contemporary historian Sima Qian expressed it. Wu Ti established a national system of transport and exchange, and sought to control trade in such a way as to prevent sudden variations in price. State workingmen made all the means of transportation and delivery in the empire. The state stored surplus goods, selling them when prices were rising too rapidly, buying them when prices were falling. In this way, says Sima Qian, the rich merchants and large shopkeepers would be prevented from making big profits, and prices would be regulated throughout the empire. All incomes had to be registered with the government, and had to pay an annual tax of 5%. In order to facilitate the purchase and consumption of commodities, the emperor enlarged the supply of currency by issuing coins of silver alloyed with tin. Great public works were undertaken in order to provide employment for the millions whom private industry had failed to maintain. Bridges were flung across China's streams, and innumerable canals were cut to bind the rivers and irrigate the fields. The situation, says Granite, was revolutionary. If the Emperor Wu had had some kindred spirit, he might have been able to profit by this and create in a new order of society the Chinese state. But the Emperor only saw the most urgent needs. He seems only to have thought of using varied expedients from day to day, rejected when they had yielded sufficient to appear worn out, and new men, sacrificed as soon as they had succeeded well enough to assume a dangerous air of authority. The restlessness of the despot and the short vision of the imperial lawmakers made China miss the rarest opportunity she had had to become a compact and organized state. For a time the new system flourished. Trade grew in amount, variety, and extent, and bound China even with the distant nations of the Near East. The capital, Luoyang, increased in population and wealth, and the coffers of the government were swollen with revenue. Scholarship flourished, poetry abounded, and Chinese pottery began to be beautiful. In the imperial library, there were 3,123 volumes on the classics, 2,705 on philosophy, 1,318 on poetry, 2,568 on mathematics, 868 on medicine, 790 on war. Only those who had passed the state examinations were eligible to public office, and these examinations were open to all. China had never prospered so before. A combination of natural misfortunes with human deviltry put an end to this brave experiment. Floods alternated with droughts and raised prices beyond control. Harassed by the high cost of food and clothing, the people began to clamor for a return to the good old days of an idealized past, and proposed that the inventor of the new system should be boiled alive. Businessmen protested that state control had diminished healthy initiative and competition, and they objected to paying, for the support of these experiments, the high taxes levied upon them by the government. Women entered the court, acquired a secret influence over important functionaries, and became an element in a wave of official corruption that spread far and wide after the death of the emperor. Counterfeiters imitated the new currency so successfully that it had to be withdrawn. The business of exploiting the weak was resumed under a new management, and for a century the reforms of Wu Ti were forgotten or reviled. At the beginning of our era, 84 years after Wu Ti's death, another reformer ascended the throne of China, first as regent, then as emperor. Wang Mang was of the highest type of Chinese gentleman. Unless there is truth in the rumor circulated on the death of the boy emperor in the year 5 A.D. that Wang Mang's family had poisoned him. Though rich, he lived temperately, even frugally, and scattered his income among his friends and the poor. Absorbed in the vital struggle to reorganize the economic and political life of his country, he found time nevertheless not only to patronize literature and scholarship, but to become an accomplished scholar himself. On his accession to power, he surrounded himself not with the usual politicians, but with men trained in letters and philosophy. To these men his enemies attributed his failure, and his friends attributed his success. Shocked by the development of slavery in the large estates of China, Wang Mang, at the very outset of his reign, abolished both the slavery and the estates by nationalizing the land. He divided the soil into equal tracts and distributed it among the peasants, and to prevent the renewed concentration of wealth, he forbade the sale or purchase of land. He continued the state monopolies of salt and iron, and added to them state ownership of mines and state control of the traffic in wine. Like Wu Ti, he tried to protect the cultivator and the consumer against the merchant by fixing the prices of commodities. The state bought agricultural surpluses in time of plenty and sold them in time of dearth. Loans were made by the government at low rates of interest for any productive enterprise. Wang had conceived his policies in economic terms and had forgotten the nature of man. He worked long hours, day and night, to devise schemes that would make the nation rich and happy, and he was heartbroken to find that social disorder mounted during his reign. Natural calamities like drought and flood continued to disrupt his planned economy, and all the groups whose greeds had been clipped by his reforms united to plot his fall. Revolts broke out, apparently among the people, but probably financed from above, and while Wang, bewildered by such ingratitude, struggled to control these insurrections, subject peoples weakened his prestige by throwing off the Chinese yoke, and the Xiongnu barbarians overran the northern provinces. The rich Liu family put itself at the head of a general rebellion, captured Chang'an, slew Wang Mang, and annulled his reforms. Everything was as before. The Han line ended in a succession of weak emperors and was followed by a chaos of petty dynasties and divided states. Despite the Great Wall, the Tatars poured down into China and conquered large areas of the north. And as the Huns broke down the organization of the Roman Empire and helped to plunge Europe into a dark age for 100 years, so the inroads of these kindred Tatars disordered the life of China and put an end for a while to the growth of civilization. We may judge the strength of the Chinese stock, character, and culture from the fact that this disturbance was much briefer and less profound than that which ruined Rome. After an interlude of war and chaos, and racial mixture with the invaders, Chinese civilization recovered and enjoyed a brilliant resurrection. The very blood of the Tatars served perhaps to reinvigorate a nation already old. The Chinese accepted the conquerors, married them, civilized them, and advanced to the zenith of their history. 3. The Glory of Tang. The New Dynasty. Tai Tsung's method of reducing crime. An Age of Prosperity. The Brilliant Emperor. The Romance of Yang Kuei-fei. The Rebellion of An Lushan. The Great Age of China owed its coming partly to this new biological mixture, partly to the spiritual stimulation derived from the advent of Buddhism, partly to the genius of one of China's greatest emperors, Tai Tsung, 627 to 650 A.D. At the age of 21 he was raised to the throne by the abdication of his father, a second Cao Tzu, who had established the Tang Dynasty 9 years before. He began unprepossessingly by murdering the brothers who threatened to displace him, and then he exercised his military abilities by pushing back the invading barbarians into their native haunts and reconquering those neighboring territories which had thrown off Chinese rule after the fall of the Han. Suddenly he grew tired of war, and returning to his capital, Chang'an, gave himself to the ways of peace. He read and reread the works of Confucius and had them published in a resplendent format, saying, "By using a mirror of brass you may see to adjust your cap. By using antiquity as a mirror, you may learn to foresee the rise and fall of empires." He refused all luxuries and sent away the 3,000 ladies who had been chosen to entertain him. When his ministers recommended severe laws for the repression of crime, he told them, "If I diminish expenses, lighten the taxes, employ only honest officials, so that the people have clothing enough, this will do more to abolish robbery than the employment of the severest punishments." One day he visited the jails of Chang'an and saw 290 men who had been condemned to die. He sent them out to till the fields, relying solely on their word of honor that they would return. Every man came back, and Taizong was so well pleased that he set them all free. He laid it down then that no emperor should ratify a death sentence until he had fasted 3 days. He made his capital so beautiful that tourists flocked to it from India and Europe. Buddhist monks arrived in great numbers from India, and Chinese Buddhists like Yuan Chuang traveled freely to India to study the new religion of China at its source. Missionaries came to Chang'an to preach Zoroastrianism and Nestorian Christianity. The emperor, like Akbar, welcomed them, gave them protection and freedom, and exempted their temples from taxation at a time when Europe was sunk in poverty, intellectual darkness, and theological strife. He himself remained, without dogma or prejudice, a simple Confucian. When he died, says a brilliant historian, the grief of the people knew no bounds, and even the foreign envoys cut themselves with knives and lancets and sprinkled the dead emperor's bier with their self-shed blood. He had paved the way for China's most creative age. Rich with 50 years of comparative peace and stable government, she began to export her surplus of corn, rice, silk, and spices, and spent her profits on unparalleled luxury. Her lakes were filled with carved and painted pleasure boats, her rivers and canals were picturesque with commerce, and from her harbors ships sailed to distant ports on the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. Never before had China known such wealth. Never had she enjoyed such abundant food, such comfortable houses, such exquisite clothing. While silk was selling in Europe for its weight in gold, it was a routine article of dress for half the population of the larger cities of China, and fur coats were more frequent in 8th century Chang'an than in 20th century New York. One village near the capital had silk factories employing 100,000 men. "What hospitality!" exclaimed Li Po. "What squandering of money! Red jade cups and rare dainty food on tables inlaid with green gems." Statues were carved out of rubies, and pretentious corpses were buried on beds of pearl. The great race was suddenly enamored of beauty, and lavished honors on those who could create it. At this age, says a Chinese critic, whoever was a man was a poet. Emperors promoted poets and painters to high office, and Sir John Manville, the assumed name of a French physician who in the 14th century composed a volume of travels, mostly imaginary, occasionally illuminating, always fascinating, would have it that no one dared to address the emperor save it be minstrels that sing and tell jests. In the 18th century of our era, Manchu emperors ordered an anthology to be prepared of the Tang poets. The result was 30 volumes containing 48,900 poems by 2,300 poets. So much had survived the criticism of time. The imperial library had grown to 54,000 volumes. At this time, says Murdoch, China undoubtedly stood in the very forefront of civilization. She was then the most powerful, the most enlightened, the most progressive, and the best-governed empire on the face of the globe. It was the most polished epoch that the world had ever seen. At the head and height of it was Ming Huang, that is, the brilliant emperor, who ruled China with certain intermissions for some 40 years, 713 to 756 A.D. He was a man full of human contradictions. He wrote poetry and made war upon distant lands, exacting tribute from Turkey, Persia, and Samarkand. He abolished capital punishment and reformed the administration of prisons and courts. He levied taxes mercilessly, suffered poets, artists, and scholars gladly, and established a college of music in his pear-tree garden. He began his reign like a Puritan, closing the silk factories and forbidding the ladies of the palace to wear jewelry or embroidery. He ended it like an Epicurean, enjoying every art and every luxury, and at last sacrificing his throne for the smiles of Yang Kui-fei. When he met her, he was 60 and she was 27. For 10 years she had been the concubine of his 18th son. She was corpulent and wore false hair, but the emperor loved her because she was obstinate, capricious, domineering, and insolent. She accepted his admiration graciously, introduced him to 5 families of her relatives, and permitted him to find sinecures for them at the court. Ming called his lady the Great Pure One, and learned from her the gentle art of dissipation. The Son of Heaven thought little now of the state and its affairs. He placed all the powers of government in the hands of the Pure One's brother, the corrupt and incapable Yang Kuo-chung, and while destruction gathered under him, he reveled through the days and nights. An Lushan, a Tatar courtier, also loved Yang Kuei-fei. He won the confidence of the emperor, who promoted him to the post of provincial governor in the north, and placed under his command the finest armies in the realm. Suddenly An Lushan proclaimed himself emperor, and turned his armies toward Chang'an. The long-neglected defenses fell, and Ming deserted his capital. The soldiers who escorted him rebelled, slew Yang Kuo-chung and all the 5 families, and snatching Yang Kuei-fei from the monarch's hands, killed her before his eyes. Old and beaten, the emperor abdicated. An Lushan's barbaric hordes sacked Chang'an and slaughtered the population indiscriminately. 36 million people are said to have lost their lives in the rebellion. In the end, it failed. An Lushan was killed by his son, who was killed by a general, who was killed by his son. By the year 762 A.D., the turmoil had worn itself out, and Ming Huang returned, heartbroken, to his ruined capital. There, a few months later, he died. In this framework of romance and tragedy, the poetry of China flourished as never before. 4. The Banished Angel. An anecdote of Li Po, his youth, prowess, and loves. On the imperial barge, the gospel of the grape, war, the wanderings of Li Po, in prison, deathless poetry. One day, at the height of his reign, Ming Huang received ambassadors from Korea, who brought him important messages written in a dialect which none of his ministers could understand. "What?" exclaimed the emperor. "Among so many magistrates, so many scholars and warriors, cannot there be found a single one who knows enough to relieve us of vexation in this affair? If in 3 days no one is able to decipher this letter, every one of your appointments shall be suspended." For a day the ministers consulted and fretted, fearing for their offices and their heads. Then Minister Ho Chi-chung approached the throne and said, "Your subject presumes to announce to your majesty that there is a poet of great merit called Li at his house, who is profoundly acquainted with more than one science. Command him to read this letter, for there is nothing of which he is not capable." The emperor ordered Li to present himself at court immediately. But Li refused to come, saying that he could not possibly be worthy of the task assigned him, since his essay had been rejected by the mandarins at the last examination for public office. The emperor soothed him by conferring upon him the title and robes of doctor of the first rank. Li came, found his examiners among the ministers, forced them to take off his boots, and then translated the document which announced that Korea proposed to make war for the recovery of its freedom. Having read the message, Li dictated a learned and terrifying reply, which the emperor signed without hesitation, almost believing what Ho whispered to him, that Li was an angel banished from heaven for some impish deviltry. It is a pretty tale, perhaps composed by Li Po. The Koreans sent apologies and tribute, and the emperor sent part of the tribute to Li. Li gave it to the innkeeper, for he loved wine. On the night of the poet's birth, his mother, of the family of Li, had dreamed of Taipo Xing, the great white star, which in the west is called Venus. So the child was named Li, meaning plum, and surnamed Taipo, which is to say the white star. At 10 he had mastered all the books of Confucius, and was composing immortal poetry. At 12 he went to live like a philosopher in the mountains, and stayed there for many years. He grew in health and strength, practiced swordsmanship, and then announced his abilities to the world. "Though less than 7 Chinese feet in height, I am strong enough to meet 10,000 men." 10,000 is Chinese for many. Then he wandered leisurely about the earth, drinking the lore of love from varied lips. He sang a song to the maid of Wu. "Wine of the grapes, goblets of gold, and a pretty maid of Wu. She comes on pony-back, she is 15. Blue-painted eyebrows, shoes of pink brocade, inarticulate speech, but she sings bewitchingly well. So, feasting at the table inlaid with tortoise-shell, she gets drunk in my lap. Ah, child, what caresses behind lily-broidered curtains." He married, but earned so little money that his wife left him, taking the children with her. Was it to her, or to some less wanted flame, that he wrote his wistful lines, "Fair one, when you were here I filled the house with flowers. Fair one, now you are gone, only an empty couch is left. On the couch the embroidered quilt is rolled up. I cannot sleep. It is 3 years since you went. The perfume you left behind haunts me still. The perfume strays about me forever. But where are you, beloved? I sigh. The yellow leaves fall from the branch. I weep. The dew tinkles white on the green mosses. He consoled himself with wine and became one of the 6 idlers of the bamboo grove, who took life without haste and let their songs and poems earn their uncertain bread. Hearing the wine of Niao-Ching highly commended, Li set out at once for that city, 300 miles away. In his wanderings he met Tu Fu, who was to be his rival for China's poetic crown. They exchanged lyrics, went hand in hand like brothers, and slept under the same coverlet until fame divided them. Everybody loved them, for they were as harmless as saints, and spoke with the same pride and friendliness to paupers and kings. Finally they entered Chang'an, and the jolly minister Ho loved Li's poetry so well that he sold gold ornaments to buy him drinks. Tu Fu describes him. As for Li Po, give him a jugful. He will write 100 poems. He dozes in a wine shop on a city street of Chang'an, and though his sovereign calls, he will not board the imperial barge. Please, your majesty, says he, I am a god of wine. Those were merry days when the emperor befriended him, and showered him with gifts for singing the praises of the Pure One, Yang Kui Fei. Once Ming held a royal feast of the peonies in the pavilion of aloes, and sent for Li Po to come and make verses in honor of his mistress. Li came, but too drunk for poetry. Court attendants threw cold water upon his amiable face, and soon the poet burst into song, celebrating the rivalry of the peonies with Lady Yang. The glory of trailing clouds is in her garments, and the radiance of a flower on her face. O heavenly apparition, found only far above on the top of the mountain of many jewels, or in the fairy palace of crystal when the moon is up. Yet I see her here in the earth's garden. The spring wind softly sweeps the balustrade, and the dewdrops glisten thickly. Vanquished are the endless longings of love, borne into the heart on the winds of spring. Who would not have been pleased to be the object of such a song? And yet the Lady Yang was persuaded that the poet had subtly satirized her, and from that moment she bred suspicion of him in the heart of the king. He presented Li Po with a purse and let him go. Once again the poet took to the open road and consoled himself with wine. He joined those 8 immortals of the wine cup, whose drinkings were the talk of Chang'an. He accepted the view of Liu Ling, who desired always to be followed by 2 servants, one with wine, the other with a spade, to bury him where he fell. For, said Liu, the affairs of this world are no more than duckweed in the river. The poets of China were resolved to atone for the Puritanism of Chinese philosophy. To wash and rinse our souls of their age-old sorrows, said Li Po, we drained 100 jugs of wine. And he intones like Omar the gospel of the grape. The swift stream pours into the sea and returns nevermore. Do you not see high on yonder tower a white-haired one sorrowing before his bright mirror? In the morning those locks were like black silk. In the evening they are all like snow. Let us, while we may, taste the old delights, and leave not the golden cask of wine to stand alone in the moonlight. I desire only the long ecstasy of wine, and desire not to awaken. Now let you and me buy wine today. Why say we have not the price? My horse, spotted with fine flowers, my fur coat worth 1,000 pieces of gold, these I will take out, and call my boy to barter them for sweet wine, and with you twain let me forget the sorrow of 10,000 ages. What were these sorrows? The agony of despised love? Hardly, for though the Chinese take love as much to heart as we do, their poets do not so frequently intone its pains. It was war and exile, An Lushan and the taking of the capital, the flight of the emperor and the death of Yang, the return of Ming Huang to his desolated halls that gave Li the taste of human tragedy. There is no end to war, he mourns, and then his heart goes out to the women who have lost their husbands to Mars. 'Tis December. Lo, the pensive maid of Yu Chao. She will not sing, she will not smile. Her moth eyebrows are disheveled. She stands by the gate and watches the wayfarers pass, remembering him who snatched his sword and went to save the borderland, him who suffered bitterly in the cold beyond the great wall, him who fell in the battle and will never come back. In the tiger-striped gold case for her keeping there remains a pair of white-feathered arrows amid the cobwebs and dust gathered of long years. O empty dreams of love, too sad to look upon. She takes them out and burns them to ashes. By building a dam one may stop the flow of the yellow river, but who can assuage the grief of her heart when it snows and the north wind blows? We picture him now wandering from city to city, from state to state, much as Zui Tsung Chi described him. A knapsack on your back filled with books, you go 1,000 miles and more, a pilgrim. Under your sleeves there is a dagger, and in your pocket a collection of poems. In these long wanderings his old friendship with nature gave him solace and an unnameable peace, and through his lines we see his land of flowers and feel that urban civilization already lay heavy on the Chinese soul. Why do I live among the green mountains? I laugh and answer not, my soul is serene. It dwells in another heaven and earth belonging to no man. The peach trees are in flower, and the water flows on. Or again, I saw the moonlight before my couch, and wondered if it were not the frost on the ground. I raised my head and looked out on the mountain moon. I bowed my head and thought of my far-off home. Now, as his hair grew white, his heart was flooded with longing for the scenes of his youth. How many times in the artificial life of the capital had he pined for the natural simplicity of parentage and home? In the land of Wu the mulberry leaves are green, and thrice the silkworms have gone to sleep. In East Lu, where my family stays, I wonder who is sowing those fields of ours. I cannot be back in time for the spring doings, yet I can help nothing traveling on the river. The south wind, blowing, wafts my homesick spirit and carries it up to the front of our familiar tavern. There I see a peach tree on the east side of the house, with thick leaves and branches waving in the blue mist. It is the tree I planted before my parting 3 years ago. The peach tree has grown now as tall as the tavern roof, while I have wandered about without returning. Ping Yang, my pretty daughter, I see you stand by the peach tree and pluck a flowering branch. You pluck the flowers, but I am not there. How your tears flow like a stream of water. My little son Po Chin, grown up to your sister's shoulders, you come out with her under the peach tree, but who is there to pat you on the back? When I think of these things, my senses fail, and a sharp pain cuts my heart every day. Now I tear off a piece of white silk to write this letter, and send it to you with my love a long way up the river. His last years were bitter, for he had never stooped to make money, and in the chaos of war and revolution he found no king to keep him from starvation. Gladly he accepted the offer of Li Ling, Prince of Yung, to join his staff, but Li Ling revolted against the successor of Ming Huang, and when the revolt was suppressed, Li Po found himself in jail, condemned to death as a traitor to the state. Then Guo Ziyi, the general who had put down the rebellion of An Lushan, begged that Li Po's life might be ransomed by the forfeit of his own rank and title. The emperor commuted the sentence to perpetual banishment. Soon thereafter a general amnesty was declared, and the poet turned his faltering steps homeward. 3 years later he sickened and died, and legend, discontent with an ordinary end for so rare a soul, told how he was drowned in a river while attempting, in hilarious intoxication, to embrace the water's reflection of the moon. All in all, the 30 volumes of delicate and kindly verse which he left behind him warrant his reputation as the greatest poet of China. "He is the lofty peak of Tai," exclaims a Chinese critic, "towering above the 1,000 mountains and hills. He is the sun in whose presence 1,000,000 stars of heaven lose their scintillating brilliance. Ming Huang and Lady Yang are dead, but Li Po still sings. My ship is built of spicewood and has a rudder of mullein. Musicians sit at the 2 ends with jeweled bamboo flutes and pipes of gold. What a pleasure it is, with a cask of sweet wine and singing girls beside me, to drift on the water hither and thither with the waves. I am happier than the fairy of the air, who rode on his yellow crane, and free as the merman who followed the seagulls aimlessly. Now with the strokes of my inspired pen I shake the 5 mountains. My poem is done. I laugh, and my delight is vaster than the sea. O deathless poetry! The songs of Chu-Ping are ever glorious as the sun and moon, while the palaces and towers of the Zhou kings have vanished from the hills. 5. Some qualities of Chinese poetry. Free verse, imagism, every poem a picture and every picture a poem, sentimentality, perfection of form. It is impossible to judge Chinese poetry from Li alone. To feel it, which is better than judging, one must surrender himself unhurriedly to many Chinese poets and to the unique methods of their poetry. Certain subtle qualities of it are hidden from us in translation. We do not see the picturesque written characters, each a monosyllable, and yet expressing a complex idea. We do not see the lines running from top to bottom and from right to left. We do not catch the meter and the rhyme, which adhere with proud rigidity to ancient precedents and laws. We do not hear the tones, the flats and sharps, that give a beat to Chinese verse. At least half the art of the Far Eastern poet is lost when he is read by what we should call a foreigner. In the original, a Chinese poem is, at its best, a form as polished and precious as a hawthorn vase. To us it is only a bit of deceptively free or imagist verse, half-caught and weakly rendered by some earnest but alien mind. What we do see is, above all, brevity. We are apt to think these poems too slight, and feel an unreal disappointment at missing the majesty and boredom of Milton and Homer. But the Chinese believe that all poetry must be brief, that a long poem is a contradiction in terms, since poetry to them is a moment's ecstasy and dies when dragged out in epic reams. Its mission is to see and paint a picture with a stroke, and write a philosophy in a dozen lines. Its ideal is infinite meaning in a little rhythm. Since pictures are of the essence of poetry, and the essence of Chinese writing is pictography, the written language of China is spontaneously poetic. It lends itself to writing in pictures, and shuns abstractions that cannot be phrased as things seen. Since abstractions multiply with civilization, the Chinese language in its written form has become a secret code of subtle suggestions. And in like manner, and perhaps for a like reason, Chinese poetry combines suggestion with concentration and aims to reveal, through the picture it draws, some deeper thing invisible. It does not discuss, it intimates. It leaves out more than it says. And only an Oriental can fill it in. The men of old, say the Chinese, reckoned it the highest excellence in poetry that the meaning should be beyond the words, and that the reader should have to think it out for himself. Like Chinese manners and art, Chinese poetry is a matter of infinite grace concealed in a placid simplicity. It forgoes metaphor, comparison, and allusion, but relies on showing the thing itself, with a hint of its implications. It avoids exaggeration and passion, but appeals to the mature mind by understatement and restraint. It is seldom romantically excited in form, but knows how to express intense feeling in its own quietly classic way. Men pass their lives apart, like stars that move but never meet. This eye, how blessed it is that the same lamp gives light to both of us. Brief is youth's day. Our temples already tell of waning life. Even now half of those we know are spirits. I am moved in the depths of my soul. We may tire at times of a certain sentimentality in these poems, a vainly wistful mood of regret that time will not stop in its flight and let men and states be young forever. We perceive that the civilization of China was already old and weary in the days of Ming Huang, and that its poets, like the artists of the Orient in general, were fond of repeating old themes and of spending their artistry on flawless form. But there is nothing quite like this poetry elsewhere, nothing to match it in delicacy of expression, in tenderness, and yet moderation of feeling, in simplicity and brevity of phrase clothing the most considered thought. We are told that the poetry written under the Tang emperors plays a large part in the training of every Chinese youth, and that one cannot meet an intelligent Chinese who does not know much of that poetry by heart. If this is so, then Li Po and Tu Fu are part of the answer that we must give to the question why almost every educated Chinese is an artist and a philosopher. 6. Tu Fu. Dao Qian, Fu Chui, Poems for Malaria, Tu Fu and Li Po, A Vision of War, Prosperous Days, Destitution, Death. Li Po is the Keats of China, but there are other singers almost as fondly cherished by his countrymen. There is the simple and stoic Dao Qian, who left a government position because, as he said, he was unable any longer to crook the hinges of his back for 5 pecks of rice a day, that is, kowtow for his salary, from the Chinese ko dou, to knock the head on the ground in homage. Like many another public man disgusted with the commercialism of official life, he went to live in the woods, seeking there length of years and depth of wine, and finding the same solace and delight in the streams and mountains of China that her painters would later express on silk. I pluck chrysanthemums under the eastern hedge, then gaze at the distant summer hills. The mountain air is fresh at the dawn of day. The flying birds 2 by 2 return. In these things there lies a deep meaning. Yet when we would express it, words suddenly fail us. What folly to spend one's life like a dropped leaf, snared under the dust of streets. But for 13 years it was so I lived. For a long time I have lived in a cage. Now I have returned, for one must return to fulfill one's nature. Po Chui took the other road, choosing public office and life in the capital. He rose from place to place until he was governor of the great city of Hangzhou and president of the Board of War. Nevertheless, he lived to the age of 72, wrote 4,000 poems, and tasted nature to his heart's content in interludes of exile. He knew the secret of mingling solitude with crowds and repose with an active life. He made not too many friends, being, as he said, of middling accomplishment in calligraphy, painting, chess, and gambling, which tend to bring men together in pleasurable intercourse. He liked to talk with simple people, and story has it that he would read his poems to an old peasant woman and simplify anything that she could not understand. Hence he became the best-loved of the Chinese poets among the common people. His poetry was inscribed everywhere, on the walls of schools and temples and the cabins of ships. "You must not think," said a sing-song girl to a captain whom she was entertaining, "that I am an ordinary dancing girl. I can recite Master Poe's Everlasting Wrong." The most famous of China's many renditions of the infatuation of Ming Huang with Yang Kui-fei, her death in revolution, and Ming's misery in restoration. The poem is not quite everlasting, but too long for quotation here. We have kept for the last the profound and lovable Tu Fu. English writers on Chinese literature, says Arthur Waley, are fond of announcing that Li Daipo is China's greatest poet. The Chinese themselves, however, award this place to Tu Fu. We first hear of him at Chang'an. He had come up to take the examinations for office and had failed. He was not dismayed, even though his failure had been specifically in the subject of poetry. He announced to the public that his poems were a good cure for malarial fever, and seems to have tried the cure himself. Ming Huang read some of his verses, gave him personally another examination, marked him successful, and appointed him secretary to General Zhua. Emboldened, and forgetting for a moment his wife and children in their distant village, Tu Fu settled down in the capital, exchanged songs with Li Po, and studied the taverns, paying for his wine with poetry. He writes of Li, "I love my lord as younger brother loves elder brother. In autumn, exhilarated by wine, we sleep under a single quilt. Hand in hand, we daily walk together." Those were the days of the love of Ming for Yang Kui-fei. Tu celebrated it like the other poets, but when revolution burst forth and rival ambitions drenched China in blood, he turned his muse to sadder themes and pictured the human side of war. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.